And we're back. All right. Welcome to another Reedsy Live, Reedsy's ongoing series of webinars where we bring on professionals from the world of publishing to show you how to write and publish better books. Today, my guest will be Oksana Marafioti. She's an author and editor here at Reedsy, and she's going to be talking to us all about the art of starting a story. She'll be going into some depth. We've got a great presentation lined up for you. So, if you're a writer of fiction, or maybe even some forms of non-fiction, I think you'll find this very useful. My name is Martin. I'm from the team here at Reedsy. We are a network of publishing professionals. We hook editors and designers and book marketers up with authors from all over the world, giving everybody access to the talent they need to publish great books and put them out there in the world. I can see a good number of folks in the comment box already. Thank you for turning up so early. I know some of the folks over in the States will be quite busy, what with Thanksgiving turning up tomorrow, so I do appreciate you spending this time with us. Just let us know where you're from. I can see already Dania, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, from London, Kimberly from Dallas, Texas. Let's scroll a bit further up. Roy from the UK. Dus Terrific from Flyover Country, USA, which I guess is what they call any state between the coast there. We have Ronald from Michigan, and Karen Mace from Tasmania, Australia, where my sister currently lives. She lives over in Hobart. Shane from Kansas. I'm glad to see so many people join us. And also good to see that within moments of going live, we've already got one thumbs down for this. I hope we'll do something to win you back. But yes, before our guest comes in, if you could like this video and subscribe to our channel, it'll help us a lot to get the word out there. If you subscribe to our channel, you'll find one or two new videos from our in-house writer, Shaylin. She puts out these great videos showing you more about the art of writing and publishing and things to avoid and things to do. It's good stuff. And also you'll get a notification every time one of these live webinars starts. So yeah, give us a follow. Hopefully we won't disappoint you. Yes, let's see who else is here. Champagne from the UK, a writer from Charmaine. We have Casey Wade from St. Louis, I guess from Kansas City. No, from St. Louis. And also we have Shirley from BC, Canada. Wow, okay, fantastic. Hopefully you are all interested in hearing more about writing, about what it takes to start a story in a way that engages your readers and gets them interested and tells them all the stuff they need to know. Oksana, she'll be the one talking you through this. I'll bring her on in just a few minutes, but Efren says Shaylin is awesome. She certainly is. HDTV from Jordan, fantastic. Darren from Kettering in Dayton, Ohio. Christian from Germany. Good to see so many folks from around the world tuning in for this. It really is good seeing such an international crowd. Take such an interest in basically developing their craft as a writer. Perhaps one day with the aspiration of putting a book out there that we're all going to want to read. Okay, so it's 8 o'clock here in London where I am, midday over on the West Coast, with probably 3 p.m. over on the East Coast, 7 a.m. as I found out it is in Sydney. Thank you for joining us, and without any further ado, I'm going to bring on our guest, Oksana. Oksana, how you doing?
Hi, I'm doing great. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fantastic. I believe you're in Nevada?
I am. And I'm looking at the chat right now, just all the people from all over the place. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, right. It's one of the great things about, I guess, the internet. You can reach to so many people so easily and, learn from anyone or sort of share what you have to say.
That's the biggest advantage, right, of what's going on right
now. I know there's a lot of stuff to get through. We're going to give folks maybe a minute or two just to pile in, but I'm sure everyone will be able to sort of catch up if they turn up a bit late. Just one piece of housekeeping from me. If you sign up through Eventbrite, you'll be getting a follow-up email next week with a link to the replay and the transcript that we'll have made. There's going to be a lot of information in today's presentation, but don't worry, you'll be able to scroll back through the video whenever you want, and also the transcript should help out with quite a lot of that. So don't worry about taking notes if that's not your style. This stuff will be here. We'll get it to you. Also, yeah, all of Oksana's details are in the video description. So if you want to find out more about her, you can just head down there and click on her stuff and see what she's about. Oksana, I'll be off in the wings. If you have any questions, just let me know. Otherwise, yeah, let me know when you want the slideshow to start.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Martin. And thank you for saying that there is a lot of information. There definitely is. Normally, I teach a 2-hour class in which I talk about all of this, the things that we're going to cover today, and we do exercises. And you will notice in the slides, I've included the exercises, obviously, because of the time constraints, we can't really do them, but hopefully you will be able to do them at some point on your own. And I think some of them some of you already do anyway. So it will be great to see that, hey, I'm actually working on my craft while I'm watching movies or something like that. And you'll know what I'm talking about. So speaking of which, the first thing that I want to say right from the beginning is that the best way to learn how compelling stories begin, or just the craft of writing, is by reading, obviously, but also by watching movies, because storytelling is something that is also used heavily in script writing, playwriting. So you don't have to feel like you only need to practice your writing by looking at other writing, even though it is helpful. So I come from a film background, so I always look at movies as a writer, which is a great way to learn some things. And we can put the slide up. Yeah, that was a little bit of just like an intro. Again, I know that we don't have very much time, so we're gonna jump right into it. So we're talking about how to start stories. If you look at the wall behind me, you'll notice there are a whole bunch of different images here, and you might see some of them clearly, others are not so clear. Some of them you might be drawn to, others you might not be drawn to. And writing kind of works on the same principle. I hear people say, just write what you like and everything will just work out. But that doesn't give enough credit to the craft of writing, because there is a structure. There is some kind of a formulaic sense to it, if you will. All right. And for those of us who are serious about it, it behooves us to learn that, right? Even if we're not going to follow the rules, even if we want to break the rules. Obviously, this is a very well-known lesson. If you want to break the rules, you have to know them first. So this stuff that I'm going to talk about is just a general overview of how to start compelling stories based on analysis of thousands of stories that have been done over decades, right? To see what works and what doesn't. And professional writers often, especially when they have to write to constriction, to a deadline, employ these because they know that these work. But it doesn't mean that this is the only way to do it. So please don't, you shouldn't take a writing class and assume that when a writing teacher talks about a certain way of doing something, this is the only way to do it, right? That is not what we're saying at all. All right, so let's get going. First, we need to, and I don't know how many of you know this or not, so I'm just talking about everything here. We need to understand that storytelling follows a 3-act structure that comes to us from antiquity. All right, we've been using it in plays for centuries. And the very first slide that you see is an example of a 3-act structure and a rising action in the story of Cinderella. And I'm not going to go over the details. If you're not familiar with Cinderella, there's lots of information on the fairy tale. But this is just one example of thousands where we start in the beginning with something that seems to be ordinary. And suddenly when things change, our main characters are thrown into an extraordinary situation. All right. In the second slide, you will see that there's another example of a 3-act structure. Now, this is something that filmmakers use as well as creative writers. And believe it or not, this applies to nonfiction writers as well. All right. So if you're writing a memoir, I'm not talking about, those of you writing cookbooks or something like that, which requires a completely different approach. In a 3-act structure, you have a setup in Act 1. Certain things need to happen in order for our reader to be engaged enough to move to Act 2. All right. And that must happen no matter what kind of a story you're writing. All right. So if you are writing for public, This is especially important to remember because our public expects certain things of us as writers. And if you don't quite believe me, think of yourself as a reader. What kinds of books do you put down, right? And what kinds do you love to read? In fact, if you've never done an analysis of a book that you really like, for example, the beginning of it, go back to it after this class and do an analysis of Act One, right? And see if you can recognize all the elements that we're going to be talking about, or some of them at least. So in an Act One, we have a setup. Act Two takes care of all of the results of the setup, and Act Three is when we have our resolution, right? The main climax takes place in the very end of a story. And this is a pretty well-known structure, and you can apply it to a lot of different stories, right? So what we will cover in this particular webinar are these four things: where to open, how to open, what to put in, and where to close. So these are very specific things: where to open, how to open, what to actually put in, and where to close. We're talking about Act One, but we are specifically talking about probably around the first 30 to 60 pages, depending on the length of your book, right? What do we need to get the story started? All right, so let's talk about that before we go into the details of what I just mentioned above. We need to introduce a desire. A character, or if you have a couple of main characters, even if they're not human, must want something. But they cannot get it very easily. This is where danger to the desire comes in, right? And they have to make a decision then, all right? And so what do we do here? We have a character that we introduce who wants something. And the audience immediately realizes that for some reason they can't have this, whatever it is that they want. And then the character must make a decision. Do I want it enough to go after it, or am I going to sit it out? Of course, most of the time, if the character, right, sits it out, then we don't have a story. So by nature, we have characters who come in and say, I want this enough. And this is what actually jump starts the story. So this is how and where you also establish your audience. This is where you show your reader what kind of a book they're reading. So for those of you who sometimes ask, well, how do you establish genre, right? What do I need to make sure that I set it up and I give enough backstory to make sure the audience knows the genre. Well, from reading the first 5 pages, I should be able to tell what the genre is based on these 3 elements: desire, danger to it, and the decision, right? Now, this is just a funny addition here. Editors often say start on the day that is different. Again, think of every story that you've ever loved, right? We don't have a character to whom nothing happens. Even if something doesn't happen to them externally, something is happening to them internally. In Hollywood, a very, very common premise is start with an arrival. Now, I'm a huge, I binge watch a lot of shows like that. I'm guilty of that. And often I will sit there and I will look at the beginning of a series or a film and I'm like, arrival. Somebody's arriving in a new town. Somebody's arriving at a new job, right? There's that element is almost overplayed, right? In pulp, which is a genre that's emerging again, re-emerging, they often say start with a fight. Start with a real conflict, right? An actual fight. Now, of course, we're not talking about not necessarily a literal fight, but having, if we're thinking about something really dramatic, having a fight scene right in the beginning of the book, or a volcano exploding right in the beginning of the book, that could be part of that start with a fight element. Now we're going to go on to A, which was where to open, right? So we're getting a little bit more specific here. And again, I'm rushing against time here. So the element of change is trouble, a moment of change. This is what you need to start a story. Something will need to change in the beginning of a story to get a reader interested. Because what the reader needs to know is that something might not work out for the character, but I want to know if it will work out for them or not. So I want to keep reading the story to see how they're going to do, right? With whatever the problem, the change is. So this change then is going to be the trigger for continuation of consequences throughout the entire book to the very end, right? it sets off a chain reaction of things, right? And in that, it builds conflict. And a very important thing is that for the character, it needs to be intolerable. All right. So the character cannot attain or attain their desire. And this is really important. It doesn't mean that it has to be, again, like a thriller or a mystery. It can be literary fiction, and the same thing will apply. There's a change going on there, and the character is in such conflict that you as a reader must keep reading to figure out what's going on. Think of Pride and Prejudice, even for those of you who have read it, which is one of the best known English classics, right? It seems like nothing's really happening, so the conflict is internal, and yet there is an intolerable state of affairs for more than one character. Now, in the next slide, we are going to see the formula for conflict. Again, formula doesn't mean you have to do this just like it is all the time, but you should be aware of this, right? So you have an existing situation. As we open the book, we have an existing situation that comes from before we met the character, right? We have an affected character. Something happens to them, right? And then there are consequences to what happens after this change takes place. This equals a renewed desire to either face the change or step back away from it, and then some kind of a danger to that desire, all right? So the stronger the desire and the danger to it, the stronger your beginning will be. So I'm going to repeat this. The stronger the desire, the character's desire, and the danger to it, the stronger your beginning will be. Now, this could apply to something simple like we have a character who just changed schools because their family moved, right? And they don't want to change schools. They left all their friends behind. This is a very common scenario, right? They are an affected character by this change, all right? So what are the consequences? They come into class, into school first day, maybe they're getting bullied, right? That could be an obstacle of some sort. Now, their desire then is what? Their desire is to fit in, maybe to prove that they belong there, right? But this bully is going to stand in the way and maybe not let them. At least that's the promise in the beginning, right? Now, again, this is a very superficial scenario, but I'm trying to give you an example of what I'm talking about. Now that the character deciding that they're going to face the desire sets off a chain reaction of events that are going to follow to the end of the story, right? So you can either start right before this change, right during the change, or right after. And if you read enough and you watch enough films, you'll be able to put a whole bunch of them into these separate categories. Some of them start right before the change, right? Maybe on the drive as the family is moving to a new town, right? Or even further back before the change. Some stories start right during the change. So literally the first scene we see is something, extreme, like somebody running away from a volcano, right? Or you could start a book right after the change, right? Somebody got stranded on an island after a shipwreck, and the first scene we see them in is on this island by themselves, right? Now, where to start depends on your story. This is, again, where your creativity comes in, right? You might know the formula, but how you handle it is completely in your hands. And nobody can really tell you how to do it. I mean, if you have a really great editor, right, or you have friends who read, like beta readers, you can give them a story and say, okay, how does the beginning look? And they might tell you, it doesn't feel like it should start here. But now, knowing this information that we're going over today, and this is why I love teaching this stuff, you have the tools to change things instead of saying, well, obviously I can't write and just stopping, right? You can look back and say, okay, I probably didn't start in the right place. I need to go back and look at it again. So building the beginning around change, how do we do that? We have an existing situation, we have change, we have a character, right? And we have consequences. What happens to the character mentally or physically after this change occurs? So I have a simple scenario here. We have a winter's day, the change is a gust of wind, a character is a man just walking down a path in a park, and the consequences is that he turns up his collar and he hurries home, right? Now, why does that not work? Let's go on to the next slide. Why does that not work is because it's too easy, right? It's too easy. So think about this and apply it to a story that you're writing. Is your challenge too easy for the character? Will the reader say, well, I could really easily just overcome that? If that's the case, you need to rethink your beginning, right? Or a reader might tell you that, like, this is just too easy. Why didn't they just do that? And I'm sure that you've seen and read moments, stories where you said, why didn't they just do that? It's kind of weird that they didn't realize that they could just do this, right? So that's an example of they're having a problem with the beginning in terms of how big the challenge is. Now, opening with change has potential problems. If you open too far ahead of change, the reader might get bored. So a lot of backstory, right? Depending on the genre, right? A backstory might be required, but it's never actually required. All right. So think about that. Open during change, and the reader lacks context. They might not know what's going on. They might need a little bit of a setup. And if you open too far after the change, you might have to explain a lot later. All right. So the first exercise, I'm not gonna talk about it. You can look at it on your own because I don't want to miss any time here. But these exercises are really great. So let's move on to the next slide. How do we open? We're talking about literally first paragraphs. All right. The very first paragraph is probably the most important. And it's pretty well known amongst editors that the most important parts of your book are the last paragraph and the first paragraph in that order. In fact, I should be able to read the first and last paragraph together and get a really good idea of what your story is about, all right? If it's really tightly knit. Now, the effective openings make the reader want more information, all right? And I have some examples here. I'm not going to read through them. You can always look at it yourself. I have examples of various paragraphs that work. Sometimes a paragraph can introduce a theme, right? That's the next slide. And sometimes you might have a paragraph that opens with a striking character action that prepares the stage for further development, right? So I have an example there too. Or you can set a fitting tone. So you have a narrator whose tone is very important, and your paragraph might serve the role of introducing that tone, that character, right? Or your paragraph can play within your paragraph, you can play with the narrative time and frame. So you can tell your reader, this is going to be the kind of a book that's going to jump around a little bit, right? And you can also start by introducing the narrator's voice very specifically. Now, in a second exercise, you can try writing an opening line or paragraph using one of the 6 methods just to see how they work together, right? Now, once you get the paragraph down, and obviously, by the way, these suggestions are not meant for you to look at as you write your first draft. I'm sure many of you have been told before, when you write your first draft, you should just let your creativity out and not think about anything related to editing whatsoever. Even if it sounds and feels to you like the worst book you've ever written, right? Even if you wrote an entire chapter and think, okay, I actually need to add a whole bunch more to it. Rather than stopping and going back and editing, write some notes, depending on how you write, in the computer or by hand. Add some notes that say, go back and add this or something like that. But the first draft is meant for you to just let your creativity out. It doesn't have to make much sense. So these suggestions, and every time you learn about editing, any kind of editing tools, are meant for the editing process, which should come after the first draft, after the writing, so that you have a body of work to look at, right? So try to resist doing that. Just go right into writing, and then at some point you get to here, right? So you can also start with unique lines, right? So of course, actually, you should start with unique lines. A unique line is something worth working on for a very, very long time. And if any of you are poets, you already know the value of a unique line. All right. And if you're not a poet, you should be reading poetry and maybe practicing it, because poets are masters at words. They're wordsmiths, right? So I'm an invisible man as an example of a unique line. 124 was spiteful. It was the day my grandmother exploded, right? So depending on the story, you should have something in the beginning that will make your reader say, I need to keep reading here. All right, something is going on here. There's something magical about this. So work on your first line, get it to the point where it shines. It's right there, right in front, right? Also, in the very beginning with first lines, there are different types of unique lines, right? And I note here a few types, but you also can add your own. You start with an anticipated. So the delicate heroine turns out to have multifaceted insectile eyes, or a hero proclaims himself a damned fool, right? Something unexpected, or a deviation from a routine. Instead of getting off the elevator at her usual floor, Jenny rides 2 stops higher, then walks back down. The reader is wondering why, right? What's going on here? Or you can start with a change that is about to happen. Someone hears the hoofbeats of a galloping horse coming closer and closer down the road. So you're anticipating, so you're tricking your reader. Writing is often and very much about psychology of emotion. All right, we connect between the writer and the reader through emotion, right? That's pretty much it with creative writing. Yes, there needs to be logic that comes with a story, but if you're not triggering emotions, the reader turns off and they don't want to read. They don't want anything to do with your story because they don't know anything about it. So the first lines and the first paragraphs are meant to hook. All right, you hook and you keep hooking and you keep hooking, right? Another way to start is paying attention to something commonplace, right? So if you're describing, and this is really important because sometimes we do that unintentionally, right? So describing a doorknob in a tremendous painstaking detail in the very first page, on the very first page, will make your reader assume there's something important about it, all right? So if you have pay an unusual attention to a particular detail, like a tree in the front yard, or the house itself, or a little girl peering out from behind the dresser, or something like that, to you, maybe that might seem like, well, I'm just trying to create an ambiance, right? But your reader will immediately think, subconsciously usually, something is going to be important here. There's a reason why we're paying attention to this parked car for a whole page. All right. So take that, take an advantage of that, right? If there's something that needs to be paid attention to, craft your beginning around that image, and it will be memorable and will make your reader want to keep going because that image is fascinating for some reason. And if you look at films, if you study films or you have backgrounds in movies or just love movies, right? Opening shots of movies are supposed to do that. That's their purpose. Literally, the very first thing you see on a screen is supposed to be somehow hooking you to the rest of the movie. So as writers, we do the same thing. All right. So let's go on. We're not going to do the exercise, obviously, right? So what do we put in, right? That's the next section. To begin a story, we create a world and we start with a blank mind. So the reader doesn't know anything about our story. They cannot tell where they are. They cannot tell the genre. They don't know anything about the characters. They're going to ask 3 specific questions. Where am I? What's going on? And who am I? Those 3 things need to be answered. All right. And I know that sometimes, again, there are contradictions. And of course, there are many different ways of telling stories. But if I'm reading something and by page 30, I don't know where I am, and it's not meant as an intentional thing, I'm going to assume it's a mistake. All right. There's a difference between intentionality and being oblivious, right? So if there's an intention behind why you're hiding from your reader where they are, that's one thing that might work, right? But if not, then we need to go back and rethink it. So you answer these questions by building a world in which you pinpoint the significant, right? So if you describe a girl or a boy or anyone in a certain way, it's going to stand out for your reader, right? If somebody's clumsy in the very beginning, and you just felt like you just wanted to be somebody to be clumsy, we're going to assume as a reader that this character is somewhat clumsy, and there was no explanation why they're not. We're gonna to the end assume that they should be clumsy. So imagine James Bond, right, a pretty popular cultural character, being really clumsy in the beginning, and then we figure out that he's a spy. Now, there are many comedies that have been made spoofs, right? Like Austin Powers or something like that. But if James Bond himself was clumsy, right, and doing all of the things that he was doing, it would be unbelievable. You would say, this is not like, no, this is just not happening, right? Create significance by association. So, does a little girl react to a tiny demon monkey perched on her bed with a warm smile and a hug, or does she run shouting, not again, right? So, creating significance by association means the way your characters react to things in the beginning will dictate to your reader how to react to things in the beginning. So, for example, this flows into setting up, creating a story world. If your story is set in a city floating through space, right, and you have a character who is walking through hallways, looking at stars through the windows, and are totally fine with it, obviously we know that this is fine. This is how it's supposed to be. Versus a character who wakes up, opens their eyes, and suddenly they're in space and like, oh my gosh, what's going on, right? Then we'll know this is not normal, right? So creating significance by association is a great way to build the world without backstory, all right? You can use symbolism, right? So if you have a storm brewing, it might, this is what Shakespeare did really well, right? Something is going on and it's a metaphor for something that's going to happen really quickly, right? Again, depends on your story. Now, where am I is a very important question too. Readers need to know where they are, time and space from the start, unless you are intentionally and masterfully writing it otherwise. I need to know if I'm in 1500s or 2000s pretty early on, normally, right? When I go into the story. And if you don't, if you want to experiment, you can do the opposite of what's said here, right? For example, intentionally start without revealing time and space. And the best way to check if it works, of course, are readers and editors, right? Because if somebody's confused, they'll tell you right away, I don't understand where I am, but I feel like I need to know where I am, right? Pluck a few significant details from the setting to set the scene. So I hear this a lot. When do I stop describing things? Because we're always told you need to be very descriptive in your writing. You do not need to be very descriptive in your writing. You need to describe only things that serve the story. So in the very beginning, depending on what kind of mood you're setting, what kind of a story you're telling, depending on what's important to show, this is what you show, right? And again, this applies to nonfiction as well, actually. I'm a memoirist by trade. I write nonfiction, creative nonfiction, and this applies to nonfiction of that sort as well. What's going on, right? That literally means what is happening right now as we're starting this story, right? At this point. So, what is the situation? What's the existing state of affairs, right? Show what happens in real time, present action rich in senses. This is how we establish that we are in a present time. We write in multiple senses. I mean, we don't have to be, nutty about it and write about all 5 senses in one paragraph. But we need to remember that usually as writers in first drafts, we mostly employ the sense of sight and hearing, right? I saw something, they saw something, they heard something. And we sometimes forget that if we're, let's say, in a room where a whole bunch of people are smoking, we're probably going to smell something too, right? So employing that in the very beginning, like setting that kind of a scene, helps us create an opening that feels real. It feels tangible. Our reader taps their emotions into the emotions of the character, and suddenly they're there. You're creating a world, right? So we present conflict and opposition in real time, and we try to avoid backstory and explaining a lot of things. This is one thing as an editor I see a lot of explanations about how the world works, why the character is a certain way. And the entire time I'm thinking, I just want to get to the story, right? Where is the story, right? So show me what's going on in real time. Show me the conflict and all of that. Now, some people might ask, but how can you establish conflict without history, right? How can you have a fight without any background to it? Now, you can, and trust me, the reader will be just fine with that. So we're a little bit, yeah, right there. Okay. So how do we do that? We write striking self-explanatory scenes, right? things that are happening in real time. The characters are interacting with their environment or other characters now, not in the past. The reason for that is that our reader can only truly experience a story in present time, in real time. Whenever we go into a flashback, the reader switches the way that they're perceiving the story and it becomes passive, right? I'm not saying a flashback is unnecessary. Sometimes they are, right? Somebody remembering something. But we need to remember that where the reader connects clearly with the characters is in the present time. So show what happens while it is happening in chronological order of how it is happening. All right. Now, the next question is, who am I? And this is about characters, right? Who are the characters? Now, you bring the character in character. What this means is that you need to think about what kind of a character you want to portray from the very beginning. What kind of a person are they? And again, look at other books, look at movies, look at shows. You will be 100% of the time able to determine what kind of a person you're seeing the first time you're seeing them, right? This will be expressed in their quirks, in things that they say, and how they're behaving, right? And an aware writer has control over that because you want a character to say something in the very beginning, right? That serves the story. The first time they appear, so they perform an act that characterizes them. You can do something like that. And we need to remember that book people are different from real people in that real people are multifaceted and we are all over the place. You can be one person one day, a different person, different day, a completely different person third day, and you change your mind about things all day long, right? But book people cannot necessarily be so multifaceted. So we usually choose main characteristics that we want to portray in our character. Does this mean they will not change? Of course not. They need to change at some point, right? So the best way then to persuade our readers, right, is to describe the character's reality and let the reader decide who these characters are. If you want to portray somebody who is a villain, don't tell us they're a villain and they're a bad person. Show us by something that they do, right? And that is important, especially in the very, very beginning of a story. So an action, right? Go back for those of you who have a manuscript, just as a test. Again, remember, these are not rules set in stone, right? Go back to the very first time you show your character on the page, all right? What do they do? And you actually will be able to tell what kind of a character you have on the page right there from their action, even if you didn't mean to. The beauty of all this is that a lot of these things you already do naturally as writers. That's why you're writers. That's why you love doing it. Somebody's drawing you to tell stories, probably because you are very good at it, right? In various stages of learning more about it. So you go back and see what's going on there. What kind of a character do I have? Sometimes, though, you might have a character, maybe not the main character, but somebody else that you brought along, right? Third, fourth person in your book. And you read the first time they appear and you say, I don't know. Like, that's not how they should be acting. I think they need to do something different now that I have an entire picture of the book. This is why it's important to have the entire book, if possible, right? Already written, so you can look at different parts of it and see how they work. So we're almost, do we have a little more time? Like 5 more minutes?
Yeah, no, we've got enough time. We've got the whole hour. There'll be a Q&A at the end, but I reckon just,
Okay.
take it at your pace. This is good stuff.
Okay. Yeah. So I just saw a chat because we stopped and I was listening to Martin, and BK said, I don't like writers telling me what to think about a character, right? So same. When I'm reading and I see a writer who says, this character was very frustrated by the fact that there were like all these kids running around and they really didn't like kids, right? I would be frustrating with somebody telling me about this character instead of showing me Scrooge in the story and letting me just see what kind of a person he is, right? In the beginning, he's a very different person from the ending, if you think about it. So he changed tremendously in the span of the time of the story, right? But I would rather be inside the story, in the skin of the characters if possible, and experience the world with them, right? Even if it's uncomfortable. This is what we're trying to get to, because reading, again, is about emotional connection. It's about plugging your reader into your story quite directly. They have no control over how they feel, okay? And in order to do that, you need to use techniques to put your reader into the shoes of the character as firmly as possible. And some of these techniques help us do that, right? So a bit more about beginning of Act 1, which is where we have desire and then a danger to that desire, right? So again, remember, change comes in, our character desires something, right? So our character desires either to face the change or to run away from it, but whatever happens to it, there are obstacles, and the first obstacle comes in the very beginning, right? So we open our story with curiosity arousing devices that establish two things. Your focal character has a goal, and this goal is threatened somehow, right? And this is where this is how you build suspense. Will they or will they not succeed? They might not succeed at all in the end. And I'm sure we've read enough stories and seen enough movies where the character doesn't get what they want. In fact, the best stories are not about what the character getting what they want, but what they deserve, right? What they need, right? But they do have a goal in the beginning, all right? And from the very beginning, it is threatened. So then how does the beginning close, right? How does this Act 1, after the inciting incident is another word for it, when this change comes in, how does it end, right? So let's say if I always use this example. I'm in my office and I'm trying, I'm done with this webinar. One day this will happen because I use this example so often. I'm trying to get out because I'm done and the door is locked. Now that's a change because this door doesn't have a lock on it. And I'm freaking out and I'm like, okay, well, what's going on? Why is the door locked? Of course, I'm going to move the handle, try to, move it around, see what I can do. It just does not give, right? Well, I happen to be afraid of small spaces, which is a problem, right? It adds, which is what we're trying to do. We're trying to make the character face like intolerable state of affairs, right? There is no window in this office either. So I can't get out any windows. I cannot open the door, right? I'm screaming, I'm crying. Yes, I'm very dramatic like that, right? Trying to get out and I can't get out. Now, the moment I commit myself to deciding to face the danger, this is where the story actually starts, right? So maybe I am in the state and I'm completely panicking, and the only way out is a tiny little door that leads to the basement that I know is haunted, okay? And I'm really, really afraid, and I never go in there. This is the only way out for some reason in this scenario, right? Am I going to go down this doorway into the basement to get out, or am I going to stay in this room? Now, the story is not going to start if I'm going to stay in this room, right? The story is going to push me, you, the writer, are going to push me to that door to face the one thing that I'm afraid of, right? And once I decide to do that, once I open that latch and I say, you know what, and I look at that black space and I can't see anything, and I say, I can't believe I'm doing this or whatever. This is the beginning, the end of the beginning. This is where the story actually begins. Everything else before that was a setup to show you what kind of a character I am, what my background is, and all of that stuff. So the decision must link to the story's very core then and follow through to the very, very end, right? And this could be the peripheral or or a mainline action or a subplot versus plot, depending on what kind of a story you're telling. And that's where we start with the story. If I go down the basement, at some point, hopefully it's not going to just end there, right? Other things are going to start happening. And this is where we hook our reader, and they have to see what's going to happen next. They have no choice, right? So this is all about not giving your reader a choice, just to keep reading to the very end. All right, so I'm going to stop here and we can move on to questions. I wanted to make sure that we have enough time for that because I know this is a lot of info.
Oh, sorry there. I'm just trying to get all my equipment back online, but that's fantastic. As Oksana said, you can put your questions here in the chat box on YouTube if you're watching live. and we'll ask you a few of those. Just because people have been asking, we will be having a transcript of this made, so if you haven't been taking notes, that's fine. Just go to blog.reedsy.com/live. I believe the link is in the video description. We'll have the transcript there later. And if you want to see the slides, the good thing about YouTube is that you can scrub your way through it. So if you want to see any of the slides again, you could basically just go on YouTube replay and just work through that. But cool. One of the questions I think someone asked here, I'll see if I can bring it up, Oksana, is about prologues. What are your sort of feelings about prologues? Is that a beginning?
Well, I mean, this obviously answers to most of these are subjective, but from what I see in the industry and from what I prefer myself is not to have a prologue because they usually are not necessary. Most of the time, as an editor, if I get a manuscript that has a prologue of some sort, to me, it feels like chapter one. That might need a little more work. So I guess if you're using a prologue to set the story up, you might need to go back and look at these notes, right, from this class, for example. You might not need to set it up in that way. However, if there's like a historical prologue that is required in order for us to feel comfortable when a story starts, that's a different scenario. But 99% of the time, we don't need one.
Cool. There's a question here about Mary asks, so has everything you've shared, can that be applied to a biography or a memoir?
Well, biography and memoir are two different genres. So it depends on what you're writing. A biography is a linear retelling of somebody's story from the very beginning to the end. It doesn't usually work on the premise of conflict and resolution, right? It's just, this is why biographies are usually written about celebrities and famous historical figures. With memoir, yes, it will apply to a memoir as well, because memoir is considered creative fiction. Especially if you're going to try to agent it and sell it to traditional publishers, they consider it creative nonfiction and treat it as if it is fiction, even if it's not.
There's a bit of a left field question from Margaret. Is trying to keep the status quo and avoiding big changes or adventure a strong enough want for a character? Is that... have you seen that?
That's an interesting question. Oh, gosh. So there's this film with this comedian. I cannot remember the movie. It's funny because I see all the details where he realizes that he's being written about. There's a narrator that's writing his life. What is it?
Stranger Than Fiction.
Stranger Than Fiction. So that might be an example of a character who's trying to avoid big changes and adventures, right? He just wants to live his life regularly. The thing is that these changes and adventures, if they're not explicit, they're implicit. The big changes then are happening internally. The changes are still taking place. I hope that answers the question.
Essie asks, how does this all work in a short story where you're limited for space?
That's how it works. The space is limited, so you have less time to write about it, right? So this is why short stories are great for practicing long form novels, because you learn, right, how to compress things. You learn the economy of words. That becomes so much more important. The structurally, it's similar, right? You introduce some kind of a conflict change in the beginning of the story, and the character in the end somehow transforms. The biggest difference with short stories is that when we meet the character, we realize that they've already gone through a lot of changes before the story started. So in essence, a short story is kind of like the last chapter of a novel.
We have a question here. Sorry there. Well, Barbara has asked for more information about our wonderful speaker and her books.
Thank you
for
the question.
Yeah. Well, we've got links to her site in there where you'll be able to find some of Oksana's memoirs. Let's see what else is here. We get this question quite a lot where people, I guess, ask for, sort of a word count or how long this should be, the opening.
It depends on how long your story is.
Mm.
This is something in terms of formula you can easily look up online. They have, like, depending on, sometimes literary agents and book publishers have really useful lists that kind of give you an idea of the word count. But generally, if you have, let's say, a 250-page book, this would take place within the first 60 pages or so.
Uh, Alan asks, is it always fundamental to start your story with your main character, or can that character come in a bit later?
That's a great question. It is not necessary at all. In fact, I'm editing a book right now that does not introduce the main character until the third chapter. It works quite well because the other characters who are introduced in the beginning are conduits to what will happen to the main character. And in that way, they're all developing within the story. They are all important.
Uh, Lana asks a question. Can you speak about this using multiple POV? I guess if you have multiple protagonists, I suppose.
Multiple protagonists will still have something that they want and that they cannot get. So actually, when I said that about the main character, this is a really good question too. It does apply to every character that you meet in the story that has some kind of a stakes in the story. They all must want something, and they all cannot get what they want. And basically, a story then is a record of how everybody's wanting something and they keep missing it, right? Throughout the story. This is how we build our conflict, is that just when you think something is going to get resolved for a character, and maybe it does for a short period of time, something else comes up immediately after, right, to make their life difficult.
Let's see. A lot of people are taking umbrage against the idea that the industry doesn't particularly seem to favor prologues at this moment. Fred says many top authors like James Patterson use prologues. But I guess if you're
Okay.
James Patterson, you could do whatever you want.
You can kind of do whatever you want, right? Yeah. I mean, his novels are a very well-oiled machine at this point, right? James Patterson probably doesn't need to sell his stories at this point, right? He just gives it to his publisher and says, "Here's another one." I wish that if I were in the same seat, I probably wouldn't worry about the structure of my novel very much.
Yeah. I get the feeling like with the sort of thrillers that I read, that there feels to be almost a law and orderfication of that type of fiction, where because a lot of television shows start with a cold open that don't feature your protagonist, it is like the crime happening sometime before. It feels like this has
Mhm.
bled into a lot of other fiction where you feel like your prologue has to be something a little bit different, featuring different characters, and then your main characters jump in and it sets some sort of tone. But yeah, from like what
That's
I've
true.
heard, nobody, when they're looking for a first time author, they want to see your characters pretty quick. They don't want to see some person
Yeah.
who's going to be dead for the rest of the story.
That's true. And somebody was asking if I'm traditionally published or self-published. I'm traditionally published, and with traditional publishers, the elements that we talk about are usually even that much more important. It seems like, especially with first-time writers. And then when you do, if you do like James Patterson, obviously the rules kind of loosen up for you, and you can experiment more. Not to say that you cannot sell your novels that are radically different from everything we talked about. And if you have one like that, please send it to me. I want to read it so that I can use it and be like, look, this person broke all the rules.
Uh, cool. All right. We'll see if there's a couple more questions coming through. If you could spot any, Oksana, uh, we can pick those up. But yeah, let's see here. Another question people have been asking is, what is the correct length for a novel?
It really depends.
The thing we found is that speaking to agents and to publishers, there is sort of basically you have to look to what the trends are. There are
Right, the genre.
yeah, certain like YA novels are like I don't know, I can't remember, but like 70 or 80,000 words. If you're dealing with sci-fi or high fantasy, you could be creeping up to about 100,000. That tends to be you go into
Yeah,
any bookstore and you'll see how thick the spines are, and that'll give you an indication of like kind of what's going on. So you probably
right.
don't want to deliver a first novel that's twice the length of everything else on the market.
And that's very easy. This information is very easy to find nowadays. Very easy. It's online. The averages for each genre, there are particular averages that agents and publishers look for generally. right? But if you're self-publishing, you can, it depends, you can get away probably with writing a novella or something like that and selling it really well. So it really depends. There are many variables that work together.
I'll post something in the chat where we actually did sit down and go through popular novels from Amazon and figure out what the average word count was. So you can have a look at that.
Ah,
But the fun thing is, if you are self-publishing, you're mostly going to be selling through ebooks, and nobody can really tell how big they are because you only have like location markers on your, on your Kindle, and a percentage of how far you've gone through it. So
yeah, and I mean, your reader is looking for particular things. I mean, has everyone seen or anyone seen the new Dune movie and read the book? I mean, the books are gigantic, or Game of Thrones is another example. But readers of those genres expect the length more than like memoir readers, who want something a little quicker, or romance readers who are looking for a very particular experience.
yeah, the fantasy readers I know do like something with a bit of heft because they know they're going to go into like a lot of world building. And
Mhm.
well,
Yeah.
yeah, if you had like a doorstop and it was supposed to be a light, fluffy romance, then you got to wonder
Yeah.
what's going on in this thing.
That's too much romance for anyone, I think.
Uh, so let's see. Efren asks, where should your inciting incident spark the conflict and the protagonist's decision to act on it in the end? All Act One, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the inciting incident is just one incident, and it should happen in Act One. That's what determines, right, the direction in which your character will go. So if you look at this, the archetype of the hero's journey, like the Odyssey, right? The inciting incident is what sets off the entire trajectory of the story, and that's what we're looking for in stories. We're used to these kinds of stories, even if they're designed in a very different, elaborate way, and very, radically different from what we read in terms of types of characters we see, the incidents, the later on things that happen to them. The skeletons of the story come to us from antiquity. I mean, literally fairy tales and mythology. It's nothing new.
All right, amazing. Yeah, before we finish up, Oksana, is there anything you want to share or plug or talk about?
I just want to thank everyone. I'm like, I read the comments as I was talking, and it was kind of going back and forth a lot. And I love all the questions. I wish I could answer all of them. I do run Lounge Riders. I'm sure you said the link is somewhere in the description. It's a virtual creative writing studio where you can take classes. During the holidays, we don't offer as many classes as we normally do. But this class is actually coming up in December, where we are going to do the exercises and spend 2 hours talking about all this stuff in more of detail. Um, and just a quick, note on writing. Um, don't let anybody tell you that you can't do it. It is often a learned craft. It's not. I really am a strong believer in that we are not born writers. Yes, some of us have like a natural affinity to doing certain things, but the hope for us all is that we can learn this. And I say that as a classically trained musician who had to learn how to play an instrument for over 30 years, right? And I'm still learning, even though some people might call me professional. And I apply that to writing directly. So don't get discouraged if somebody's telling you your first draft is no good or something like that, but do learn. Probably the biggest uh, tool that you can have is how to look at your writing objectively, kind of as an editor. So learning the different details of how the story is structured can be so helpful and make you feel good about what you're doing instead of helpless. Sometimes that doesn't feel good when we write. I don't know why we write, because it's such a hard thing to do, right? But we're all here for a reason.
Yeah,
So good luck, everybody.
amazing. Well, I've pinned the link to where the transcript will be, along with some more details. Thank you so much, Oksana. I hope we can have you back on next year. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. To Americans, happy Thanksgiving. Hope you have a peaceful one. See you all soon. Bye.
Thank you.